Here we go on lecture 3, which will be about painting and pictorial designs in the 6 dynasties. I have to begin with a note on nomenclature. Calling it the 6 dynasties is using a really old-fashioned name for this period, which represents the almost 4 centuries between the 2 great long-lasting dynasties, the Han, which ends in the early 3rd century, and the Tang, which begins in the early 7th. In the 3,000 Years book, which we use, it's called The 3 Kingdoms, 2 Jin and Northern and Southern Dynasties. Well, that's more accurate, but it's rather ponderous. And Thorpe and Vinograd, in their book, call it the Age of the Dharma. Dharma is the word for the Buddhist law. The period of division. They emphasize the rise of Buddhism and the lack of any single ruling power in North and South. Well, that's all right, too. But, again, rather ponderous. I'm going to use this old 6 dynasties period, old term, for convenience. Well, as I emphasized at the beginning of these lectures, you're going to have to get historical background mostly elsewhere. I will only make very brief remarks and maybe recommend readings. I'm not going to lecture at length on the intricacies and complexities of 6 dynasties' power struggles, the rise and the fall of states. And I'm also not going to do more than give you the simplest remarks on Buddhism. Now on the screen are two pictures of the Dunhuang caves at Dunhuang, a place in far northwest of China, from the 6 dynasties period. These are from the Thorpe and Vinograd book. Okay, Buddhism enters China from India, first by sea and later through Central Asia, and it had already entered by the Han period and became a great force in Chinese civilization in the centuries that follow. I myself was never strong in Buddhist art, and I won't show much of it in these lectures. I'm going to leave out completely, for instance, the wall paintings in the great Buddhist caves at Dunhuang, which are now on the screen, examples. This is a site, as I say, in the far northwest of China. Some of you will have been there. Well, these make up a lifetime pursuit for many scholars in the field. And although I've been there, and I was as much impressed or overwhelmed by the wall paintings as anybody else, they don't fit into my present account of early painting, especially landscape painting in China. Also from Dunhuang, there are a great many portable paintings, on silk mostly, taken away by foreigners, now kept in museums in New Delhi and London, the British Museum, also in Paris, anyway. I'll show paintings that are associated with the Chan or Zen sect of Buddhism in the last lecture. The last lecture will be entirely devoted to that, in fact. But that's all we're going to do pretty much about Buddhism, with a very few exceptions. Now, will you put on a map, please, so I talk about a bit about the history of the 6 dynasties. I'll say only that there was more or less constant warfare going on in the north, and which was occupied, big regions of it, by non-Chinese people who came down, borderland people, came down from the north and the northeast. And the warfare and the occupation forced a lot of the Han Chinese, the native Chinese, down to the south. And they settled down in the Yangzi River, the Jiangnan region, especially around the city of Nanjing. And Nanjing became the major intellectual artistic center at this time. So now we go on to look again at the paintings and the pictorial designs from the 6 dynasties period that are found at other sites in Dunhuang. I'm also going to make some brief remarks on calligraphy in this period, although I'm not going to speak at length about calligraphy. It's one of the drawbacks of this course, you might say. And I'll talk a bit also on 2 major 6 dynasties texts on painting, the real beginnings of the great rich Chinese literature on our subject. There are really 2 notable developments in painting of this period. First, the appearance of important individual artists, and one of them, GuKaizhi by name, to whom several important early paintings are attributed. And secondly, the great development of painting theory, especially landscape painting theory in this period. Okay, now on to the paintings. I begin with 2 slides from the previous lecture to remind you of what we saw. These two pictures can serve also to represent the high points of Han painting and pictorial art, and to remind us of the beginnings of landscape representation in that period. We'll see landscape much advanced in the post-Han period in the lecture that follows now. Well, now we'll talk about designs representing the 7 worthies of the bamboo grove in a tomb near Nanjing. And here we see not the 7 worthies, but a similar tomb wall and a rubbing from it. I put this on just to show the material and the rubbing. I talked already about rubbings last time, so I don't need to do that again. This one represents an immortal, or a kind of Taoist fairy, playing with a dragon, pursuing a jade bee disc. Bee disc is a disc with a hole in it, which we see in the middle left here. And they're both pursuing it and dancing along, full of movement. Anyway, I'm putting this on, as I say, just to explain the material. It's made up of molded bricks, each of which has part of the design. It must have been a multiple copy production intended in order to justify making it in this way. The designs, that is, must have been repeated more or less in different tombs. And some of them, I think, are, as the excavators have said. Anyway, here is what Thorpe writes about the material and technique, quote from the Thorpe and Vinograd book. The technique employed required stamping the narrow edges of bricks into a master mold, so that when they were assembled in proper order, the larger composition took shape. The making of the master molds presumes drawing a full-scale cartoon that was transferred to the molds. The cartoon, in turn, must derive from an original design, whether conventional or from one of the famous painters of the period, end quote. Now, that, as I say, is put on just to show the material and how they're made. And the next, please. Now, this is one of 2 long wall designs from one of the tombs in Nanjing, and this one represents 4 of the 7 worthies of the bamboo grove. These large rubbings were exhibited in the Nanjing Museum when we visited it in 1973, and we made slides from these large rubbings. The 7 figures, the 7 worthies of the bamboo grove, were prominent figures in the cultural life of Nanjing, who withdrew into the forest or the bamboo grove to commune with each other and with nature, to drink wine, to escape from human society. They are well known from writing of the time, and they are known to have been depicted in paintings, by one of them by GuKaizhi, an artist we'll speak of later. Here is then we see these 4 seen between trees, and they are more or less paired, but they're still individual figures. There's no real interaction between them. They're identified by names written between them, beside them. The trees are individualized by leafage, or different species of trees anyway. This is common in 6 dynasties. The basic motif of man under tree means man in nature, and this is a very fine example of it. Here's the other wall. The figure at the far left is named Rongqiji, and he's actually an earlier figure who was added simply to fill out the space. They needed 8 of them for the 2 walls, but there are actually 7 sages of the bamboo grove. The next slide, please. Here is one of the figures named Han Tao holding a wine cup, and on the ground beside him is the wine bowl from which he gets more wine when he's finished it. Seen, as I say, between the trees and sitting on a kind of mat. There's no real indication of further space in these, and not much indication of ground except what is established by placing the objects. And they have conventional props which are which identify the figures who are, as I say, well known in this time. The next, please. 2 figures from the from this long wall. The one on the right is named Ruanji. I'll speak of him in just a moment. And the one on the left somehow doesn't have a label. But at any rate, the figures are, as I say, not really, they're paired without really seeming to respond to each other. They're individualized, and set between the trees in a kind of convention. They sit very comfortably. Their clothes are loose. Some of them have musical instruments they're playing, and they convey the attributes that are associated with these famous men. Here's a close-up of Ruanji. He was well known for his ability to whistle, a kind of piercing sound that he made partly with his fingers, apparently, and his pursed lips. Taoism, about which I'll speak in a minute, Taoism was deeply concerned with the phenomena of sound, with sympathetic resonance, with people and things vibrating in harmony, mysterious harmony, although they're separated in space. This is the very symbol, perfect symbol of the Taoist idea of things somehow responding to each other in a way that is not physically cause and effect. Obviously, the Six Dynasties people didn't understand about resonating air pressure, and all the things that we do, or how sound is transmitted. So they saw it as a mysterious affinity of some kind. Anyway, here is Ruanji leaning, his clothes loose, sitting comfortably on the ground, leaning back on one arm, and whistling. Here's a close-up of the chin player, plucking the strings of his instrument with his right hand, fingering the strings with his left. We saw an actual chin, or zither, in the previous lecture, along with a group of tomb figurines playing them. Well, this is the time to talk a bit about Taoism, which is important to the rise of landscape and the writings on landscape in this period, which I'll talk about later. So keeping these images on, I'll speak a bit about Taoism. Taoism had arisen in the 5th to 4th century BC, that is in the late Zhou period, as an alternative to the human-centered systems of Confucianism and legalism. Taoism denied the value of everything that Confucius preached. It concerned itself with the problem of understanding the natural order, bringing oneself into accord with it. This was an individual quest, which could only be impeded by adherence to social conventions. This early form of Taoism was deflected or distorted in the later centuries, Han and afterwards, into a quest for magical powers or for eternal life. In the Six Dynasties period, another form called Neo-Taoism arose and took several directions. One of them was abstruse speculation, intellectualized commentaries on the early Taoist texts and so on. Another was the practice of something called Qingtan, literally pure conversation, a kind of mystical dialogue full of metaphysical hyperbole, grandiose images, meant to induce a transcendental state of mind in its participants. Most of the point for us was a continuation of the early Taoist belief in the simple or natural life, unspoiled by urban sophistication. The natural man was the ideal. And this led to the ideal of the Taoist recluse and to the desire to get away from the cities, into the wilderness, to cleanse the spirit. Human society was seen as contamination. The 7 sages of the bamboo grove were represented here were 3rd century people and epitomized this somewhat escapist movement. About Ruanji, the one we see whistling, it was written by a contemporary, quote, "He would sometimes climb the mountains and look down on the waters, forgetting to return for days on end," end quote. And this, you understand, was some 1100 years before Petrarch in Italy. Petrarch, about whom Sir Kenneth Clark writes in his famous series on civilization that he was the first person ever to climb a mountain to enjoy the view. Well, that was Sir Kenneth Clark's idea of civilization, which is something that begins in the Fertile Crescent and it moves to Greece and Rome and is developed there, and then it moves across Europe and becomes concentrated in England, and bits of it drift across the Atlantic to America. Anyway, that's a very special view of civilization that is not mine, obviously. Anyway, going back. Earlier from the Han Dynasty, we have some high-pitched descriptive writing, lush, full of rich images, in a rhyme prose form called fu. And some of these fu deal with amorous encounters between humans and the gods or goddesses of the mountains and rivers. This is a survival of older, somewhat shamanistic beliefs and practices turned into poetic imagery. We have a famous one, for instance, in which a certain emperor has a overnight affair, or a sexual union anyway, with the goddess of Mount Wu. So a dream of Mount Wu always means sex. But there's not much evidence of any response to real scenery, real scenery of nature in the Han Dynasty. But this literary form somewhat underlies the Six Dynasties' conceptions of emotional response to nature, about which I'll be talking. From the 3rd century A.D. onward, arises a nature poetry, begins to be composed at this time, culminating in the 5th century in a contemporary of GuKaizhi whose name is Shi Lingyun, 385 to 433, who wrote poetry about his direct experiences of nature. Quite fine poems. They have been translated. So, although early Taoism in the Han Dynasty had seen the natural world as an antithesis to human society and given it some metaphysical significance, it didn't pay much attention to nature in itself, nor did Buddhism place any value in the phenomenal world. Whereas the Neo-Taoists of the Six Dynasties, on the other hand, who were less serious philosophically than either of the others perhaps, were more devoted to the cultivation of individuality and to the natural world. And this was also a period when great figure painters were active in Nanjing. Dai Kui, GuKaizhi, Laura writes about them, even though we don't have any paintings by them. Later in this lecture, we'll look at paintings attributed to GuKaizhi. But first, I want to pay some attention to other pictorial materials that survive from this period. Let's go on now. All right, here are designs on the two faces, front and back, of a lacquer screen from the tomb of a man named Sima Jinlong, located near Datong in the north of China. He died in 484, so that's the date roughly of the tomb. This is reproduced in the various books. This is from a reproduction. I have slides made from the original, but they're marred by light reflection. I'll show them in a bit. These show the whole of the two front and back faces. And each of them, as you see, has 4 scenes arranged vertically, and they have cartouches or labels, the yellow rectangles with writing in them, which identify the scenes. And they're scenes of filial piety and various moralizing stories and quasi-historical stories and so on. Chinese love these moralizing stories, especially at this time. Okay, let's have the next, please. Now you see the bad reflection. The lacquer has a shiny surface when it dries, or not dries, hardens, and therefore it's harder to photograph effectively with a flash gun the way I did all these. One of the good things about Chinese painting for us specialists is that it's mainly on silk and paper. And silk and paper are absorbent. They absorb the light. And so it doesn't reflect from the surface this way. Our colleagues in European art cannot go around making slides from oil paintings because the reflective surface of the oil paintings it creates effects like this, bad light reflections. Lacquer does the same, so we have to put up with it in these pictures. But they do show more than the reproduction. At the top we see a scene of filial piety, and we'll see another version of it in a stone engraving from a later period in a bit. I'll show that. But this is a story of a filial Shun, one of the sage emperors of China, mythical characters. And according to the story, his father and brother tried to kill him by sending him down a well and dropping rocks on him. And he escaped, but he didn't condemn his father for this. He kept his filial piety, that is. And the emperor of the time, the sage emperor, heard of this and called him and designated him as his successor as emperor and gave him his 2 beautiful daughters in marriage. Then below that, a scene I don't recognize, women. And then below that, one I'll show, and I don't know what the story is, but we'll look at it. And then down at the bottom, one I don't have a slide of, representing the emperor riding in a palanquin and a court lady, Lady Ban by name, refusing to ride with him. We'll see this in a scroll attributed to GuKaizhi. She is invited by the emperor, that is, to ride with him in this palanquin, and she refuses on moral grounds. I'll speak about that when we come to it anyway. Okay, here is the scene of the next slide, the filial shun. Well, lacquer, as I said in the first lecture, is made from the sap of a bush, the lacquer bush, and when it hardens, it's extremely inert, and it can be colored with mineral pigments, black, brown, yellow, typically. Here, the additional painting has been done on the faces and elsewhere, I guess, in pigments that are more fugitive, that don't last as well, and the faces have come off and so forth. But basically, lacquer lasts very well. As you see, it has a certain volume. The lines are raised from the surface. And this is the story of the filial shun, whose father tries to kill him, and who eventually becomes one of the sage emperors of China. This image of the female figure, with the heavy robes occupying all the volume, and no sense of body beneath, and with ribbons fluttering behind them to give a sense of motion to the image, is one that we'll see quite a few times in this lecture. It's very common in the Sixth Dynasties period, that is. Here's another scene, which I don't know what the story is, but someone named Lu something, and a woman, beautiful woman, dancing in front of him, tempting him perhaps, and he resists the temptation, and therefore he's virtuous, some such story. The story is told in this panel on the left, written in this yellow rectangle. Okay, so much for that. Now we go on, next slide please, to talk about the Dongxian tiles. These are bricks or tiles that are molded, and most of them painted also, as we'll see in another one, that are found in a tomb at a place called Dongxian in Henan province, also in the north, and they belong to the 6th century AD. In size, they are about 38 centimeters in length and about 19 centimeters in height. There are 34 different designs of them in the tomb, and they have relief designs, some of them with color added by hand. These are talked about, and some of them represented in the catalog by James Watt of art from the Metropolitan Museum catalog of art from the Han to the Sixth Dynasties. I'll have that on my reading list. To the Tang, rather. Okay, this is a rubbing from one of them, with a running horse and 2 grooms. As we'll see throughout this lecture, the effective movement and of swift movement is a basic desideratum for Sixth Dynasties artists. They achieve it in various ways. Here it's real movement, a real horse cantering along, or galloping, well, whatever it is, and 2 grooms running beside it, one of them holding its halter, and the various ribbons and the horse's tail and so on streaming behind. Another of the Dongxian painted tiles features a design showing a serpent copulating with a tortoise. These belong to an old Chinese creation myth. Movement here is rather in the long, curving lines of the serpent and the highly activated plant forms at both sides. This is another of the Dongxian tiles, and this one, a slide from the original, which is painted in mineral colors, which have been pretty well preserved. And this one is an outdoor scene, and at the left is a Taoist immortal, or kind of fairy again, who is seated on the shore of a lake. You can see the lake shore and down below him, undulating line, and darker. And then a tree behind him, which shows he's outdoors. This is a symbol of man outdoors, as I say. And he's playing a musical instrument called the sheng, which is a kind of mouth organ. You can still find them and hear them played. They're still practiced, that is. Vertical pipes, and you finger them and play chords mainly. Tunes, I guess you can. At any rate, he is doing it with some mysterious music to conjure up a phoenix, magical bird that appears before him, having swooped down from the clouds. And again, you see the tail and everything, wings streaming out behind him, behind it, that is. And then over on the right is another Taoist, a female Taoist of some kind, holding some kind of scepter or wand, like a brush. And then up above you see clouds scudding, indicating the outdoor scene, but also movement again, and what probably is intended for distant hills in the far upper right. Anyway, an outdoor scene with all the elements that make up the scene. Here another one that's painted in bright pigments. This is the story of the filial Guo Chu, who spends all the money he has in order to bury his father after his father dies. And as he is digging his father's grave, he finds a pot of gold that's been put there by his good fairy to reward him for his virtue. And the good fairy appears over on the right, another of these female images with streaming ribbons and so forth, as if sort of in fast movement. We'll see this scene also in the stone engraving. No, maybe not. Okay, anyway. The carver of the mold, as you see, has not allowed for the reversal of the design from the mold to the printed or the molded brick, and so the characters are backwards. Okay, then we go on to more important works, which are the great, well, often reproduced, very much discussed, stone sarcophagus slabs in the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City, representing scenes of filial piety. These were found near Luoyang in the north and belong to the early 6th century, or at least so most people believe. This is a rubbing from one of the two long slabs of the sarcophagus. The end panels are less interesting, and they are engraved with scenes of filial piety. We also have on the screen the right 1/3 of this, with one of the stories, which I'll talk about in a bit. Each of the long slabs contains 3 scenes, each of which pictures 2 episodes of the story, or most of them do at least, and I'll show them and talk about that. Paragons of filial piety and other paragons that are in the stories that are represented are identified in cartouches or labels hanging down from the top, as you see. Each of the slabs is about 2¼ meters long, about 64 centimeters high, and they're engraved, as I say, in polished stone. Probably they're based on paintings. Almost certainly they're based on paintings. A engraver of the tomb slabs is not going to be able to make up compositions as elaborate and fine as these. Soper, Alexander Soper, who writes about them, I'll talk in a minute about that, Soper guesses that they probably were based on paintings brought from the south, rather than by some local artist in the north. They came, as I say, from a tomb near Luoyang, which also contained an inscription, a funeral elegy, dated to 522. Sickman, Lawrence Sickman, who bought these for his Nelson Gallery in Kansas City, dated the engravings around 525. Others have dated them a bit later, but everybody who accepts them as early puts them generally in the early 6th century. The narrative scenes, 3 to each of the slabs, are set off by trees and rocks, between which you see the figures acting out the narratives. And most of the stories have 2 scenes, as we'll talk. And cloud scrolls are used for decorative borders. Now these scenes and the Nelson Gallery sarcophagus generally have a special importance for the development of our field of Chinese art studies. Alexander Soper, an important pioneer scholar in the field, I talked about in the first lecture, published 2 articles in Art Bulletin, the journal, Art Historian's Journal Art Bulletin, in 1941 and 1958, defending them as early works against the doubts that had been expressed of them by his teacher, George Rowley. George Rowley, professor at Princeton University. And Soper's articles, arguing for the earliness and importance of these works, are among the earliest art historically high-level writings on Chinese pictorial art that we have. I used to have my students read them regularly. I made them available to them. Well, I should say there's still some controversy about the dating of these. There's still people who believe or who question the earliness and the authenticity of them and think that they are modern forgeries made up in modern times, in other words. But most people now accept them as early as I do, and I'll speak about them as works of the early 6th century. Okay, here is the scene at the right of that, representing the scene of the filial Yuan Ku, and he is seen. There are two episodes on the right and left, seen between rocks and trees. In the one on the right, the Yuan Ku's father and the young Yuan Ku are burying the old man, his grandfather, on a litter. The family is very poor. The father has decided they don't have enough to feed the old man. They can't feed everybody. They're on the edge of starvation, so they carry the old man. He decides to carry the old man out into the forest and leave him there to die, to starve. And so here they are carrying him out in a litter. Then, in the scene on the left, seen also between trees, these follow-up, you see the old man indeed seated on the ground with grasses and so forth around him. And then you see Yuan Ku and his father leaving, but Yuan Ku picks up the litter and carries it. And the father turns and asks, "Why do you bring the litter?" And Yuan Ku says, "We're going to need it when you grow old." And the father gets the point and changes his mind, and they carry the old man back, and everything ends happily. Great story. These stories, they are very entertaining, even if you leave out all the moralizing stuff. Okay, as a composition, these are far more sophisticated than anything we've seen up to now, obviously. You don't have such a strongly tipped-up ground plane as in the earlier pictures that we looked at. The straight-on view raises problems of keeping the different planes of depths clearly separated. That is to say, the problem of overlapping has to be somehow met by the artist. And he accomplishes this by seeing things between other things. You're looking between trees, a figure is seen between two trees, or the whole scene is located between rocks rising near the foreground. The tall trees, some of which come from near the bottom of the composition, serve as what we used to call repoussoir, a French term that means pushing back. And indeed, they push back the things that are seen between them. And then we have backup rocks in middle distance, seen behind the old man on the litter here, for instance. And the backup rocks and the foreground rocks and trees, anyway, all establish what the old term is spaced cell. I use that in relation to a painting at Ma Wang Dui. That is, you establish a cell of space by enclosing it with various objects. And it's been done really very effectively here. There's also a kind of indication of the ground with fallen leaves and so on, running water, and it goes back not too far into a sort of a shallow middle distance. And then in the upper left you see the far distance, there's no continuous space at all. That's way in the future in Chinese landscape painting. But you do see round lines, and you see distant hills. We saw distant hills already in one of the Sichuan tiles and various other things, so that's not so new. But, and as I say, it's not really any continuous space here by any means. So, but this is all very effective as a setting for narrative. The trees being blown by the wind, like this middle one especially here, this is a convention, but a very effective one for enlivening the scene. And it's like the convention we see in numerous representations in the 6 Dynasties of court ladies or other ladies depicted with long ribbons from their robes blowing as if in the wind, even though they may be indoors. But this activation of the scene, this calling up of sense of motion and liveliness, is one of the chief aims of the artist. The rocks we see here, these tall vertical rocks with slanting tops, are of a type called shui. Sullivan writes about them at length in his book on early landscapes. Quite interesting. Shui was actually an architectural form, a tower in the Han Dynasty, recorded in the Han Dynasty. And in the 6 Dynasties, this term comes to be used for the dwelling place of a deity or a spirit. rocks, tall rocks with slanting tops of this kind, and they become a kind of convention of Six Dynasties painting. Here, next, a detail of this, showing the people carrying the old man on the litter close up. The figures are fairly well articulated and individualized. We can imagine a lively practice of narrative painting going on behind these, moralizing painting and so on. Either in the north around Luoyang, as I say, or as some have hypothesized, in Nanjing, assuming the designs have been brought to the north and reproduced in these engravings. Now, in the other end of this long slab, we see the scene of the filial Shun, the legendary emperor, and his father, as I say, and his younger brother send him down a well and drop stones and earth on him. We see this in the left section here between the trees in the far group. And then in the foreground, you see Shun escaping. He makes his way through some underground passage to another well and climbs out and somehow escapes being killed. This is a well with a rectangular top. And he does not give up his devotion to his father, his filial piety. And the emperor of the time, hearing this, rewards him by calling him to a meeting and designating him as his successor, the next virtuous emperor, and also gives him his two beautiful daughters in marriage. Here a detail, next please, a detail showing Shun climbing out of the well, this nearer well with the rectangular top, and behind the father and brother, echoing each other, facing each other across the space, paired figures of a kind we see often in Six Dynasties art, dropping stones down the further well, the one he escapes from. And here, next please, the two beautiful daughters of the sage emperor of the time who become Shun's wives, these lovely moving figures with all the streaming ribbons and so on. It's typical of China that he has given two wives. If it were a Grimm's fairy tale, at the end the hero is rewarded by marrying the daughter of the king. But this is China, and he has two wives. So, I mean, if it's really eminent people are allowed more than one wife consort and so on, emperors are allowed lots of them. Okay, then going on. The other long slab seen here, at the left end is the story of the filial brother Wang Lin. Filial Wang Lin is a filial brother in this case, and he is captured along with his brother by bandits, and he offers to give his life if they will free the brother. And the bandit leader is so impressed by his virtue that he turns both of them loose and departs. Well, this is a very interesting entering and leaving scene. The bandit leader on horseback is seen coming in at the left, between trees again, as always, accompanied by his fellow bandits. And then you see the two brothers bound, kneeling, one of them, in front of him. And then again at the right, the later section of the scene, in which the bandit leader departs. Well, this coming and going scene is part of the same kind of echoing, mirroring, paired figures, one facing in, one facing out, or facing each other, which are seen throughout Six Dynasties art. And it's a stage in the development of figure compositions as a way of achieving space, of relating figures, of handling certain narrative details. It's quite effective anyway. Okay, then we go on to the central section. Here we go. Next slide. This is the story of a filial son who saves his mother's coffin from burning when the buildings around it are on fire. There is a fire, and he goes into the building where his mother's coffin is and throws himself over the coffin and prays, whatever. And indeed, the building is spared from the fire. All the ones around it are burned, whereas this one is saved. And then we have, let's see, to the left of this is not really two sections exactly, but two different scenes anyway. To the left of this, here are the detail of people trying to put out the fire. Somebody has brought a large jug of water and is pouring it into a large basin down below. The fire drawn in quite beautiful curls of there are a number of fire scenes in early art that are drawn in this way, in a sort of decorative curls for the fire. It's effective. It's not too realistic, but it's all right. And then the two figures here are the people who are helping to put out the fire, but are mirror images of each other, both with their hands raised. Now this is a very interesting convention, or as I say, a stage in the development of figure compositions. As many of you know, we have something like it in Italian painting of the, not early, but middle Renaissance maybe. I remember a painting of St. Sebastian, it must be, the one who was shot full of arrows. And in the foreground you see two archers with crossbows, one facing in, one facing out, leaning to reload their crossbows. I forget who the artist is, but at any rate, it's the same kind of pairing, and it has the same effect of establishing space of the figure is looking out at, and the space that the other figure is looking in at, and so on. And their gestures are also mirrored. Okay, so it's interesting that two quite different traditions will achieve the same kind of convention, but very far apart. This is, you understand, early 6th century, and the other is whatever it is, 14th century. I don't remember exactly. Okay, next is a scene of the filial Dongyong. I'm not quite clear what the story is here, but it's another of the filial piety scenes, and I can't remember quite the story, didn't look it up. At the left, the carrying the old man in a cart, and the filial Dongyong looking back and gesturing, and then later you see him confronted by another fairy who's going to reward him for his good deeds in some way. And again, quite beautifully drawn trees and clouds and tall rocks and space cells in which the figures are set. When I talked about the art historical concept of the space cell in the previous lecture and in this one, I failed to note, as I should have, that it was Bachofer who formulated this concept through his analysis of early Chinese pictorial designs, and who first used the term. He had studied in Munich with the great pioneer art historian Wölfflin, and was attempting with considerable success, I think, to work out a style periodization of the same kind for early Chinese pictorial art. This was an entirely valid project for which Bachofer deserves a lot of credit. Instead, he was criticized by sinologists because he didn't read Chinese, and later by politically driven critics, whom I referred to in the first lecture, who charged him and others with wrongly imposing art historical patterns derived from Western art history onto the Chinese materials. This is, I think, entirely wrong-headed. Bachofer and Luhr and Soper and others were not imposing, they were observing and describing, enabled by their training in the much more developed field of Western art history to recognize visual phenomena that others couldn't recognize. And in doing this, they made important contributions to the field. Luhr's triumph in defining the earliest styles of Chinese bronze decor, before archaeology proved him right, at a time when all his book-reading opponents had it wrong, has now come to be generally recognized. There's a recent book on it by Robert Bagley, who teaches at Princeton, and like myself is a Luhr student. Bachofer's contributions, I think, should be recognized as well. Down in the foreground, two deer. Here, a detail, next please, of the deer. One can imagine a supple, naturalistic kind of painting behind this. Nothing primitive at all anymore. This is quite sophisticated and lovely. Almost, well, to the point where some people doubt the authenticity of it. I'm inclined to think it's a very fine work of the early 6th century anyway. Now we go on to talk about a few other things before we come to the great Handscroll composition that I'll talk about. Here are two stone slabs, stelae, Buddhist stelae, S-T-E-L-A-E, the plural, I think, of stela, with landscape designs in relief carved on the back of them. These are from the early 6th century. They were found near Chengdu in Sichuan in the southwest, yeah. Again, they're in the book, the catalog by James Watt. But there are a number of these with dates on them. The inscriptions on the other side are sometimes dated, which means that we have datable representations of landscape with Buddhist scenes, Buddhist narratives going on in them, as like these two. Well, I used to talk about them along with landscape elements in the wall paintings at Dunhuang, the great Buddhist wall paintings in the far northwest of China, in order to talk about the gradual conquest of large-scale landscape scenes, the conquest of space from additive kinds of this kind, as you see here, in which the shapes of the peaks are defined and then the trees and other figures and so on are drawn within them for the narrative elements, to more unified spacious schemes. All right, up above you see of this one, you see a scene which has something like the Chinese version of perspective. They experimented with something like Western perspective during this period, and you see that in paradise scenes at Dunhuang and so on. This is a big subject for other people, but not for me anyway. Well, okay, these stelae are interesting and important, and as I say, they've been used as datable examples of landscape imagery. The type here with the images, the figures, and other things set against the outlines of the hills are like, well, they're like the Han tile that we saw representing a salt mine, in which the figures and trees were set against the outlines of the hills similarly. Well, the use of these, as I say, as datable examples of landscape is very much worth doing. I used to lecture on this some and show Buddhist things, and art historians attempted it in fairly early time. Bachofer and Lohr especially both made good tries at setting up the development of landscape space and so on. Lohr not so much in his book, but in his lectures. Ludwig Bachofer is someone I didn't speak of last time when I talked about major figures in the generation before me in Chinese painting studies. I should have. He was Lohr's teacher. He moved from Germany, Munich I think it was, to teach for many years at the University of Chicago. And he had distinguished pupils, including, among them, outstanding, Harry, or Father Harry van der Stappen, Jesuit priest who taught. He succeeded Bachofer in teaching there. He did important work on Ming painting, so-called Ming Academy of Painting, among other things. He was a fine man whom I knew very well, and he was a much revered teacher. But anyway, to get back to the systematic style history of the development of landscape in the pre-Tang period, based on materials such as these, somebody should do it, I think. And I suppose somebody will eventually. I hope so. But it's outside my present purpose, and I'm not going to do that at length. Instead, I'll go on to look at the Handscrolls attributed to this artist named GuKaizhi. First, however, I want to speak very briefly about calligraphy in the Six Dynasties. Calligraphy has a great development in the Six Dynasties, and the most famous calligraphers of all time are active then, and works that are by or after them or attributed to them can be extremely valuable. These are by or after Wang Shizhi, 307 to 363, the greatest of all Chinese calligraphers, most people think, and Wang Xianzhi, who is his son. And they represent the development of the cursive forms of calligraphy, Xingshu, or running script, and Zaoshu, draft script, draft rather than grass. It was once translated as grass, but it really means draft. And it means that scripts that were developed for drafts of documents or for fast writing. If you have to send some sort of a message on the battlefield you do it by writing fast. This developed in the Han Dynasty already, these cursive scripts. And then they developed into an art form, a very important art form in the Six Dynasties period. And the great calligraphers are active then. Well, this is an important part of Chinese art history. There's very good scholarly writing on this subject by Wen Fong, Dick Barnhart, very strongly, and others, Fushan, others. It's not a subject on which I myself have ever published anything. I'm not good on calligraphy, and I won't do anything more than call your attention to it here, and maybe a few points later in my lectures. The one here by attributed to Wang Shenzhi, we have a label on the side and seals. So I'll talk about all those things later. And then an inscription written later by somebody at the left. Okay. Now we come to the first of the Handscrolls, we'll see, and to the first painting we've looked at that has a name attached to it. This is by, this is attributed to GuKaizhi. It's the first painting we've seen that isn't devoted to landscape also, although it has a mountain in it. It's mostly figure painting, and definitely Confucian in nature, not Taoist. But I'll spend some time with it because it's an extremely important painting and a very beautiful painting. It's the painting called The Admonitions to the Court Ladies, a hand scroll in the British Museum in London. As I say, this is first work we've seen with an artist's name attached to it. But it's only an attribution, which means that his name is attached to it, but it doesn't mean that it's by him. Very definitely not by GuKaizhi, in my view. Chinese collectors wanted big names. They had little patience with anonymous works, unless they're very old and fine, and even then they preferred to have names attached to them. C.C. Wang, my good friend, who I talked about quite a lot in the first lecture, major Chinese connoisseur in the tradition of connoisseurship. C.C. Wang used to argue that a great painting had to be by a great master, and therefore he wanted his paintings with names attached to them. Max Lohr tries to associate early works that he reproduces and discusses with the names of great early masters of that time. Does this in ways that go beyond anything that I would do. I don't believe that much in attaching names to early paintings as he did. But in fact, most of what we have from the early period is essentially anonymous. The first paintings we're going to see with really reliable signatures on them, so we can say this is by so-and-so, are from much later, the 11th century, largely. There may be one or two before that we can attach to particular artists, but not much. So I will use the names, but I'll continually caution against taking them as real indicators of the actual authorship of the painting, which they are not. Talking now about the hand scroll form. This is the horizontal scroll, called hand scroll, shoujuan in Chinese, and it is called that because you look at it with your hands. It's kept rolled up except when it's actually looked at. Hand scrolls are typically anywhere from 8 or 9 inches up to a foot and 18 inches even high, but that sort of range. And they are made so that you can look at them on a table in front of you. And you unroll them from right to left, holding, you expose as much as you can hold easily between your outstretched hands at one time. Maybe 3 feet, whatever it is, however long your arms are. Anyway, and then you look at them on the table, and you go from the right end to the left end, reading them like over time, in a form that could be used in various ways, as you can imagine. Very good for narratives, very good later for continuous landscapes, and so on. Okay, anyway, the hand scroll form. And here we see the beginning of one, this very famous one, attributed to GuKaizhi in the British Museum. GuKaizhi was born around 345 and died around 406 in the early 5th century, that is. This Admonitions to the Court Ladies in the British Museum is a scroll that was originally in the Palace Collection in Beijing, in the Imperial Garden probably, or somewhere in one of the buildings there, and was looted from the from the Manchu Palace during the Boxer Rebellion around 1900, when the British troops were in the palace and rampaged through the imperial gardens and carried off all kinds of things. Eventually, the scroll was brought to the British Museum and sold to them in 1903, and it's been a treasure in the British Museum ever since. The text for the admonitions to the court ladies was composed in AD 292 by a Confucian scholar official named Zhang Hua as a didactic text offering advice on deportment and conduct to the palace ladies. There are more historical implications of it, which I'm not going into here. Not relevant, really. Now, there have been all kinds of studies of this and accounts of what's happening in it and so on. One of the earliest of them, and still one of the best really, is by Arthur Waley. Arthur Waley, the great translator of Tang poetry, of Lady Murasaki, the Genji Monogatari, translator of early philosophical text, Zhuangzi, Leizhong, marvelous scholar, never went to China, that's another story, lived near the British Museum, rode his bicycle around London. I visited him in his last years in his upstairs apartment near the British Museum, spent a very fascinating afternoon talking with him over his had a little stove there. Anyway, that's another story. He published a book in 1923, which was a really important early attempt at writing a kind of history of Chinese painting. He didn't have much available at that time, but he did the best he could with what he had. It's called An Introduction to the Study of Chinese Painting, and it's still worth attention. I'll use his names for the subjects and use his translations of the text as we go along. Now, the attribution of the painting to GuKaizhi is not really all that early. The earliest text that ascribes the painting to him is from the early 12th century, so the attribution is not by any means reliable. There's a lot of controversy about the dating. I'll speak a bit later about a symposium that was held just about this painting in 2001, 8 years ago. And I'll speak about that after we look at the painting some. Let's look at the painting now. It's on silk, it's in line and color, and it's very much damaged, but well preserved for a painting so old. This, I guess, was made before a later restoration. It doesn't look quite so damaged now. Now, I have two kinds of slides in our departmental collection at Berkeley. One was made by somebody who doesn't pay any attention to the scenes, but simply shows one section after another, sometimes breaking up the narrative scenes right in the middle. And another set which is more careful in showing the individual scenes. I will use both. Let me just say a thing before we go on about the seals seen here. These are the rectangles and squares in red impressed on the painting. As most of you know, the seals are cut in soft stone, or sometimes in jade, but mostly in soft stone today, and in reverse, of course, and then you pat it against a pad that is inked or charged with a red pigment in oil, cinnabar, and then you impress it on the painting, and there are indications of ownership, or sometimes people who saw the painting. But Chinese connoisseurs pay a lot of attention to these, and they don't block their appreciation of the painting as much as they might for us, until we become used to them at least. The big seals tend to be by emperors. Connoisseurs and collectors, particularly the good ones, put their seals on the mounting, or if on the painting, very small. Here, if I could spend an hour talking about the seals here, a 16th century collector, famous, named Shang Yuanbian, Shang Maolin, his seals are here. Ani Zhou, An Qi, a 17th century collector, and others. And the Emperor Huizong, I'll talk about him because you have a piece of calligraphy by him at the end. Two of his seals are here, Zheng He and Xuan He, anyway. Here I show a real seal with its carved end toward us. An impression made from it at the right, and at the left a covered dish with a pad of seal pigment in it, on which the seal is patted so as to coat its surface with evenly with the pigment, and then you impress it on paper or silk. Okay, at the first scene, we see the Lady Feng defending the Emperor Han Yuandi of the Han Dynasty, that is, from a bear that had escaped from the imperial zoo. You see her and the bear and two guards. The bear is not all that big and fierce, and the two guards are fending it off with spears. But the lady has interposed herself, Lady Feng, between the bear and the emperor, and supposedly saved his life, which is her virtuous act. Then we have the scene in which the Lady Ban declines to ride with another Han emperor in his imperial palanquin, lest she should distract his thoughts from affairs of state. Well, here in the section where we see the palanquin on the lady, we see that he is actually riding already with another woman sitting beside him. So he's not all that lonely, and he's not all that deprived if she won't ride with him. Anyway, she, as I say, on moral grounds, won't be seen riding with him in the chariot. The four bearers of the chariot, large figures, look almost like they're dancing, carrying it along. But at any rate, the chariot itself is drawn so that to make space for the two figures in it. The canopy over the chariot is held up by poles stretching up from the base of the chariot, and one of these, the one on the upper left that stretches up to the near corner, doesn't really attach to the corner. It's sort of misattached, going to the wrong place. A paper by a scholar named Chun Bao Jun, which I'll talk about later, points out places like this in the scroll where a copyist seems to have misunderstood some representational point in it, and maybe copied it slightly wrong. I'll talk about that a little later as we go on. I just pointed it out here. Now, the next section, the text reads, "In nature there is nothing high which is not soon brought low. When the sun has reached its noon, it begins to sink. When the moon is full, it begins to wane." And in the whole scene, you see an archer kneeling at the left, shooting at an arrow at a tiger, which you can see here in the upper right of the mountain. Rather hard to see, but there it is. And this is a rather simple rendering of the idea that everything high will be brought low. He is shooting the tiger down, so to speak. The motif of an archer shooting at a tiger on a mountain is much older than GuKaizhi. It appears as seen here on one of the stamped pictorial tomb tiles from the Han Dynasty. The archer seated on the left mountain in each scene, aiming his crossbow at the tiger, seen near the top of the right peak. The extreme disproportion in sizes of the scene persists in the image in the admonition scroll. Now we go back to that. Here again you have a representation that seems to illustrate the words rather than making a picture that really renders the moral message of the talk. Okay, up above you have the sun and the moon, and then you have two partridges, birds, at the upper left of the mountain. Now a detail of the mountain itself. This mountain has been used very properly as an early example of landscape in the days when we didn't have nearly as much as we do now to talk about early landscape. So people would discuss this and discuss the probable date of it. Michael Sullivan had an article in which he dated it maybe as late as the 11th century because certain conventions of representing foliage where he thought didn't turn up until then. Anyway, here we see the mountain drawn in repeated outlines, generally repeated, showing the various peaks and the folds of the slopes of the mountain, and some shading of color or washes from one to the next. This is indeed a very early form of the landscape, and it worked quite well. There's one flat section down here, a kind of plateau, and as I say, two partridges, one in flight, seen here, and the tiger. Next, please. Okay, the next text says, "Men and women know how to adorn their persons, but few know how to embellish their souls. And the picture shows ladies who are adorning their persons. Again, it's more literal illustration to the words than a picture that really embodies the moral message. Well, it shows two women, both of them looking into mirrors. The one to the right and closer to us is we see her actually with her reflection in the mirror. The next, here's the detail of that. You see her reflection in the mirror. Chinese mirrors, which still survive in many, many examples, were made of bronze, but in such a way that they had, when they were new and polished, had very fine reflecting surfaces, supposed to be as good as our mirrors with glass and mercury. So they say. At any rate, here she is seen using one, and then the further woman, who's having her hair done by a maid, is also looking into a mirror, and you don't see her reflection, but each of them is reflected in the mirror, and the two of them reflect, so to speak, each other nearer and further. So you have a kind of complex, interesting double mirror effect here. Quite interesting for this early period, certainly. You know that mirror reflections and such are much talked about in European art. Velázquez, Las Maninas, the mirrors and that people write analyses of the picture that are more complicated than the picture itself almost, and the mirror plays a big part in that. Well, that is not as what we see here is not so complicated as that, but it's very interesting and complex for such an early period. In the woman here, the further woman who's having her hair done, she kneels on a mat, and she has in front of her a lacquered toilet box, black on the outside, red on the inside, with little things, various cosmetics in it, and the lid to the right, and then another layer of it in some kind of rectangular tray. And then in front of her, this mirror stand with a mirror on it, and her mat. These establish the ground plane very well. We don't have any real indication of floor in this painting, or in any early painting for that matter, and we don't have any further wall or anything like that. All that comes later, insofar as we have it at all. But at any rate, it's still a very effective way of establishing space in the picture. Now, going on, here, which is the famous bed scene, says, the text goes, if the words that you utter are good, all men for 1,000 leagues will make response to you. But if you depart from this principle, even your bedfellow will distrust you. And you see a bearded man seated here in the bed, his legs outside, turning toward a lady in the bed who is presumably distrusting him. I mean, she's supposed to have a distrustful look. Here a detail of that scene, the bed. Well, this is again a very effective way of using furniture to establish space. Here the whole, big rectangular space made up by the bed itself. The curtains hanging down from it are shaded, dark shading, heavy shading, and anyway, it is, I say, is really very effective. She hangs her arm over the edge of the bed and so on, and they face each other. So the space between the two of them and the space of the bed are, complement each other. Before going on, let me point out that the vertical panels at the far end of the bed appear, when you look closely, to have ink monochrome landscapes painted on them, in a style that belongs to a much later period. As we'll see later in this lecture, in the landscape painting that appears on the boat window in the Nymph of the Law River scroll, and as we'll see also in a number of times in later lectures, landscape paintings within copies of early compositions often reveal the real date of the copy. That may be the case here. I leave this as a suggestion for someone else to follow up, using photographic enhancement to make these more clearly visible, if they are indeed there. Here's an actual bed from it's actually later, it's Ming Dynasty, but it's the same kind of bed. And this is a slide made at the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City. Lawrence Sickman, who bought the stuff, or most of the stuff for the Nelson Gallery in the old days, was a great furniture expert at a time when furniture was not that much studied. There were a few others, but he was a major figure in the study of Chinese furniture. He had spent a lot of time in China, and he'd learned a lot of things about things the Chinese appreciated that most Westerners didn't. Anyway, he bought fine furniture for the Nelson Gallery, and this is a bed that can be used to put beside the picture, the GuKaizhi picture, and so on. Okay, next. Now, the next scene, the text says simply, "Your race shall multiply." And you see what it is a family picture. And this is very Confucian, as I say, very stable family. And the most stable form is geometrically, is of course the triangle, and that's what you have here. A very stable family with the man of the family down at the base of the triangle on the right here, the largest figure, closest to us, looking very large and severe and substantial, and then some shading in the robe, and then beside him the woman who's probably his principal wife, and over on the left 2 other women who must be his concubines, presumably, and then 2 boys. In these pictures it's always sons who are represented, never girls. One of the boys, the one in the center here, playing with a ball, although his face looks curiously pained instead of somebody having fun. Up above, then, anyway, are presumably the older son and maybe a younger son, and the older son's wife, making up this very stable family group anyway. Okay, next. Now, this is the scene with just 2 figures and no setting at all, but very beautiful, which I reproduced in my Skira book. The text to it says, "No one can endlessly please. Affection cannot be for one alone. If it be so, it will one day end in disgust." This seems an odd kind of moral admonition to us with the way we favor, at least in principle, long-lasting marital alliances. But this, after all, is about attachments within the court, not on the outside society, where monogamy is encouraged, but although not as much in China as here. But at any rate, in the case of the emperor, you didn't want really anything monogamous. If he became attached to one of his consorts as against the others, this could be a real problem. We'll talk later in the Tang Dynasty about an emperor who becomes too infatuated with his consort, Yang Guifei, and this leads to the downfall of the state, practically. Anyway, it was the emperor was supposed to have lots of consorts and to give them equal favor, or more or less equal favor. So here you see this man, presumably the emperor, and one of his consorts moving toward him. He meanwhile turns away from her. It's quite expressive, the 2 figures, and he gestures with his hand in a way that seems to hold her off. Faces are inexpressive, that's standard. The woman, on the other hand, seeming to move toward him with these trailing ribbons and so on. A very effective, very beautiful scene. As I say, the scene that I had in my Skira book. Now, the next section, this is the last section of the scroll. And at the right of it, you see a lady kneeling in a pose of, well, it would be calm respect, because the text that it illustrates says, "Fulfill your duties calmly and respectfully." This is the end, that is, of the admonitions proper to the court ladies. And then here she is with these trailing ribbons fluttering up in the air as if wind blown and so forth, all we've seen. A very fine kneeling figure. Then here at the end of the scroll, the text says, you see a lady writing on a tablet, which she is holding, and then 2 court ladies in front of her. And the text says, "Thus has the instructress, charged with the duty of admonition, thought good to speak to the ladies of the harem." Okay, so that ends the text and ends the painting. Over here at the far left, you see what's meant to be a signature, but it's probably added later. It says GuKaizhi Hua, painted by GuKaizhi, but that can't be right. And then lots of famous seals of famous people, emperors and others. And this is the actual end of the scroll. Now, okay, here are the 2 ladies facing each other in a way we've seen, paired in the standard way, All of this we're very familiar with by now. Now here, in the next slide, is the end of the scroll and what comes after it. After the hand scroll, after the painting proper, come some stretches of mounting brocade, 2 sections of pale blue-green and 1 of yellow. And then comes the first of whatever series of inscriptions mounted after the scroll, called colophons. Now, we use the term colophon, you use it in books to indicate what is not part of the book, but is separate. For instance, you have a publisher's colophon that tells you at the beginning when the book was published and how many copies and all that. And sometimes you have at the end a colophon that tells who the designer was and what the typeface was and things like that. Colophons, separate from the book proper, but included in the book. Now, on scroll paintings, we use the term colophons for inscriptions that are mounted after the painting, separate from it, but pertaining to it, of course. And they tend to be poems that somehow harmonize with the subject of the painting, or written by people who see it and write these colophons, or sometimes they are appreciations of the painting. We have long, interesting colophons for most famous hand scroll paintings. So at any rate, then also you have a lot of seals. Here in the upper part of the center of this section is a seal reading Junyu Zhongbi, meaning to be treasured among the myriad jades. And it's the seal of a 12th century Emperor Zhangzong, a Jin emperor anyway, and various seals of famous people. And as I say, these for the connoisseurs of China are very, very important. You have in the center here seals of a great 17th century collector named Liang Qingbiao, who had the good taste and good sense to put his seals on the mounting, usually, if not always, instead of putting them on the painting proper, and very well cut seals and so on. He was a specialist in figure painting, and he owned lots of famous figure paintings. Okay, and others. Then, dropping very much in taste and good taste, we have a orchid painted here, Chinese orchid on the yellow mounting silk by the Qianlong Emperor. That is the emperor who served in the Qianlong era, 1735 to 1795, in the 18th century. He was not, I would say, a great collector. He was a powerful collector, say, and he amassed most of the great collections of the time and put them all in the imperial collection when they came down to us as the Manchu Imperial Collection, now divided between the 2 palace museums mostly. Anyway, another story, and this is also his inscription up at the top here on the yellow thing. I should say a word about why I and we collectively talk about the Emperor Huizong versus the Qianlong Emperor. This is a convention that was adopted some decades ago, and I think it's still followed. The difference is that Huizong is a name of the person. It's a posthumous name, but it's still a name, and it relates to the person. The emperor, who may have had several eras under his reign. Huizong, I think, had 2. Xuanhe, Zhenhe, but some of them had more. At any rate, it's a personal name, the Emperor Huizong. On the other hand, Qianlong is not a name of the person, but a name of the era, 1735 to 95. So we have taken the convention of saying the Qianlong Emperor. He had a name, but nobody remembers it. So anyway, that's about that. Now here, next, is the calligraphy of the Emperor Huizong, done in the so-called slender gold style. It's very elegant, reedy, beautiful calligraphy. This emperor who reigned in the early 12th century, we'll talk a lot about him when I come to that period, because he was a painter himself, amateur painter, great collector, powerful man, and so on. Now, as I've said, there's a lot of argument about the actual date of this scroll. The essays in the volume edited by Shane McCausland, Princeton PhD, who now living in England, as I've said, convened a symposium about this scroll, completely devoted to this one work of art, at the British Museum, held in 2001. and then published a book of the papers from that symposium in 2003. Important book with a lot of very important scholarship in it. Some of the participants, including Wen Fong, Yang Xin, the former director of the Palace Museum, Dick Barnhart, others, argued for an early date, pre-Tang, before the Tang Dynasty. Some are even saying, why don't we say it's by GuKaizhi and be done with it? On the other hand, a paper by Chun Bao-jun argued in another direction. Chun Bao-jun she was a Princeton PhD originally. She teaches at Taida, or Taiwan National University, very fine scholar, and her paper did a stylistic analysis or stylistic comments on the painting, but also pointed out those points in it where the copyist seems to get things wrong. Now, I didn't point this out as we went because I didn't have the right slides, and I'll do it instead for another painting we're going to see in several versions, that is the Nymph of the Law River. There I can talk about this effectively. I can't here. But anyway, Chun Bao-jun gave this very, very good paper telling what I think is the truth about the painting, that it is an early copy of a still earlier painting, that is. I myself wasn't invited to contribute or to speak. In fact, I was rather pointedly not invited at all. But it was very much a Princeton and China event. Oh well, there it is. And I went anyway, and with my wife Xingyuan and Xingyuan Zhao and our two boys. And I got permission to talk for 3 minutes at the symposium, and I used it to agree with Chun Bao-jun and suggest a date, maybe in the late Tang, something like 9th century maybe. That could be wrong, it could be a bit earlier, but it's definitely, I think, not pre-Tang, not before the Tang. Well, as I say, I'll talk about that issue more when we come to the Nymph of the Law River. I should say here, before going on, that there's another fine and important but unexciting hand scroll attributed to GuKaizhi in the Palace Museum in Beijing, titled the Lianu Zhuan, is the text, or the Wise and Benevolent Women, or famous women, more loosely. A hand scroll, and that's reproduced, a section of it in the 3,000 Years book, discussed by Wu Hong and so on. I'm going to show details from this scroll without commenting on them while I talk about an important text of this period. Well, this is a good place to introduce and to explain briefly the so-called 6 laws, or liu fa, or 6 canons, or 6 principles, however one wants to render the term fa, contained anyway in the introductory section of a text called the Gu Huapin Lu, Classification of Old Painters, by a writer named Xie He, who was active around 500 to 535. Xie He gives critical comments on painters active before his time, grades them, talks about their styles and so on. But he precedes these sections on individual artists with an introductory section giving his 6 criteria of judgment, the liu fa. A good discussion of these is in Susan Bush and Shouyan Shi, the Early Chinese Texts on Painting, a book that I introduced in the first lecture, a very important book, pages 10 to 15 on the liu fa. It's good, except that Susan Bush ends up accepting a reading of the 6 laws proposed by a scholar named William Acker, which I think was wrong. Acker proposed a new reading, a new rendering, but also a new grammatical or syntactical construction for the 6 laws, how you punctuate, so to speak. Chinese isn't punctuated, but as if you did. Well, at any rate, on this matter, my reasons for thinking that Acker is wrong and my arguments for what the 6 laws really mean, you can see my website, jamescahill.info, and CLP, Chinese Lecture, Cahill Lectures and Paintings. Cahill Lectures and Papers, number 174. I put it there a couple years ago. This is titled, quote, "Good Grief, Not the 6 Laws Again!" exclamation point. And this facetious title was meant to suggest this would be my last word on the subject, but obviously it wasn't. Here I am still talking about them, probably go on till the end of myself anyway. There I cite several major sinologists who, and their versions of the six laws, who agree basically with my construction of them, my idea about the syntax of them at least. And they include such important people as Edward Schaefer, and Peter Budberg even. So if you're interested in the six laws, go there and find it and read it. And the three different renderings of the six laws, that is, William Acker's, Alexander Soper's, and my own, are conveniently printed together in the Thorpe and Vinograd book on page 177. So you can find them there if you want to just read a quick thing. Anyway, in my reading, to go on to the six laws, in my reading, the six laws are made up of 3 pairs of 4-character phrases, each of the pairs syntactically parallel in good Sixth Dynasty style. That is, if you have a verb-object pairing in one, you have the verb-object in the corresponding position in the other one. The first pair, as I would render them, goes, engender a sense of movement through spirit consonants, qiyun shandong, and second, use the brush with the bone method. These are the most difficult and problematic of the 6, and I won't use the time to discuss them in detail here, except to say that the sense of movement must have had to do with that liveliness of brush drawing that I referred to at the end of my first lecture and have brought out in some later things, as well as to the sense of the animation in the things and the people portrayed, as I've been trying to bring out in discussing early paintings in the 6 dynasties. And that spirit consonance must refer to that kind of sympathetic resonance between the things of the world that early Taoists recognized, how that is the shun, or the spirits that inhabited things, vibrate together in harmony, even though the things can be removed in space. Anyway, my thoughts about the 6 laws are all in this paper in the CLPs on my website, so look there. And my 1961 article called The 6 Laws and How to Read Them, which was appended to a review of Acker's book, and seriously interested people referred to those. The second pair of Shehe's laws goes, responding to things, depict their forms, and, according to kind, describe appearances. That is to say, the artist responds to the things of nature or to other people and catches their outer and inner nature and appearances in his painting. The third and the simplest pair, the last pair, is dividing and planning, positioning and arranging, number 5, and number 6, transmitting and conveying early models through copying and transcribing. These are simply matters of composition and of positioning one's style in a series of styles inherited from the past. Okay, enough for that. To continue on with the visuals, another important early composition ascribed to GuKaizhi is the Handscroll composition titled The Nymph of the Law River. Well, let's see the first slide to go into that. Here we are. This is a long section. I'll keep it on while I talk for a bit. Again, the attribution to GuKaizhi is late and unreliable. The composition is old, but the earliest extant versions of it, which we'll see, are probably not earlier than the 10th, 11th century or so, maybe 12th century, something like that. GuKaizhi is known to have painted landscape themes. He wrote an essay on how he would depict a certain scene. And he painted a portrait of a contemporary of his named She Kun, placing him among the hills and rocks. And when asked why, he explained that She Kun himself had said that even while he was serving in court, he felt most at home away from human society, among the hills and streams. So, he was the kind of person, that is, that felt most comfortable outside, not among human society. And this had become a kind of valuable attribute in the 6 Dynasties period, as I talked about in relation to the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. Okay, the Nymph of the Law River, which we see the first section of the Beijing version here. This is from a reproduction, of course. I could never make a slide like this with my flash gun. The Nymph of the Law River, this version, and then we'll see another one in the Liaoning Museum. Both of them are much reproduced. I'll give references in my handouts. And then there's a version in the Freer Gallery of Art, a third version, which is incomplete, which I'll show later. I'll spend some time with these since the differences between them are important to our understanding of Sixth Dynasty style, but also to the differences between authentic paintings and copies. Now, these scrolls illustrate a fu, or rhyme prose, composed in 223, the Lo Shan Fu, by a poet named Zhao Zhi. Dates are 192 to 232. Zhao Zhi, and he's presumably, it's told in the first person, so it's or the understood first person. So it's as if it is an experience that he himself had in a confrontation with this nymph of the Law River. And this, as I say, is the beginning of the Beijing version. I'll show these one at a time and tell the story. Here at the beginning of the scroll, at the far right, you see the horses and grooms. The poet has come to this shore of the river with the horses and grooms, but then he has left them and walked to the edge of the river. And here in the middle of this section, you see him standing with his attendants, his entourage. We'll see them in detail later. And then over here on the left, you see the nymph of the Law River floating out over the river. Very beautiful. We'll see details of all this. Then in the next section, next please, just a minute. Here, next section, the nymph invites him to join her in some kind of amorous dalliance down in the depths of the river, presumably. And he at first is very tempted to go. I mean, she's beautiful, and everything is right for one of these great sexual encounters between the human and the deity. But then he remembers stories he's heard about mortals who have been lured to their death by supernatural beings, and he wonders about going down into the depths of the river and so on. And while he's still trying to make up his mind and hesitating, the nymph becomes disgusted with him anyway, and she departs. She leaves, and you see her going off. Actually, I think that's what is happening in the left section of this scroll. So you see her on the river again, surrounded by rocks and trees and hills and so on. And then a whole group of other lesser deities, gods and goddesses of the natural features of the scene, are named in the poem, and the artist represents them here, floating on the water or floating over the land or floating up in the air, some of them. Okay, that's the next section. Then the one beyond that, this is the last section of the scroll. Actually, there's one missing, but so there should be four. But anyway, this is the last section. You see the poet, Zhao Zhi, seated on the bank of the river, on the right here, with two of his attendants. He sits and wonders whether he did the right thing, and is anyway sort of sad, having missed his chance to have this affair with the nymph of the Law River. And then one of his attendants holds a parasol over him and so on. And then at the left here, he is departing in his chariot. Well, I will show details of this from one or another of the scrolls as we go. So this is just to tell the story. Now to go on. Now I'll have a series of details beginning with the details from the Beijing version, which is the best preserved and just physically the most beautiful version. At the beginning of the scroll, as I say, the poet is dismounted and has left his horses and to be tended by the grooms, and you see the horse whirling over up above, just in relaxation, and the groom beside it. This groom in the upper part is a lower class character with hair exposed and so on. The groom down below seems to be slightly more upper class with some kind of official cap or something. At any rate, the two of them are also kind of echo each other, one leaning one way, the other way. And they're set between trees and hills and so forth. Okay, then on to the next one. Here we see the poet, Zhao Zhi, and his entourage. Quite a number of them, as you see, quite a body. The stories of the men who sought reclusion in nature in the Sixth Dynasty texts are somewhat offset for us by when we read that they took with them big parties of attendants who beat down the bushes, carried their provisions and things to drink, wine to drink, all of that, carried furniture for them to sit on, things to shade them from the sun, etc. So they're not really like our people going into nature, not like a Berkeley Sierra Club backpacker with his backpack and so forth. Not at all. Very different. But at any rate, the fact that they did go out in nature at all is pretty remarkable for this early period. Okay. Then here is the nymph floating over the water. As I say, very beautiful. The sun up above with the raven in it, as always. And the landscape made up of outlined hills and trees, rocks, with heavy green color, blue and green color, and mineral color over them. And she floats, as I say, over the river. Here's a detail of the nymph. She turns back to look at him and is inviting him to join her, and so on. The trailing ribbons indicate her, in this case, her real movement as she floats over the water. The nymph of the Law River, by the way, was the subject of the only joke that we heard really during our 1973 trip, the one with Sherman Leah's chair. During the month we were in China, we were in Luoyang. I mean, everywhere we went, we had banquets given by the local officials. Sometimes the mayor would be our host, sometimes some high official on the cultural bureau, whatever. And there would be banquet speeches and toasts and all that. It was quite enjoyable, good dinners. And in the Luoyang dinner, Luoyang means a bank of the Law River, and it is indeed near the Law River. In the dinner at Luoyang, Sherman Lee, our leader, made in his speech, made a kind of little joking question asking whether they still saw the nymph of the Law River from time to time. And the host, whoever it was, I can't remember who it was, answered, or at least the interpreter, if it was interpreted right, he answered, well, she appears from time to time, but we don't recognize her. And that was a good joke. Sherman Lee at least thought, and I thought too, that was the only one we heard in a month-long tour of China. Anyway, so there's that. So anyway, to go on, the poet is strongly tempted, as I say, but he hesitates, and he hesitates too long. And the nymph of the Law River, miffed, goes off floating over the water. And then you see all these other local deities, the wind god and so on, who appear in the sky or down below. All of them named in the poem. I won't identify them all. But here you see her floating over the river again. Very beautiful. This version of the scroll is particularly well preserved and particularly visually beautiful. And here is the detail of her floating again with her ribbons floating behind her. Okay. This was the version that we all knew first, before one in the Liaoning Museum, which I'll show next, before we knew about that. So this is the one that was reproduced by Suren in his 1957 book, and so on. And we were very anxious to see it, and we saw it in Beijing and all, made lots of slides and so on. Then we went on to Liaoning, up further northeast, and saw another version, which is here. This is a section of the Liaoning version. This is from a reproduction, of course, not from a slide I made. This also came from the Manchu Imperial Collection. It's also a complete composition, the same composition pretty much, but it has the text written here in the space between the pictures, as you see. In the admonition scroll, you had text written between the scenes. Well, that's rather different because the scenes were separate. And it separated one episode, not one episode, one section of the text from another. Here, the text is written into a picture that is actually takes the form of a continuous narrative, that is as if continuous space, except that the same characters will appear again and again inside this space. So this is a new form, and one of the forms of which the hand scroll is very effective and very well used. The calligraphy specialists, I'm not one of them, say that the text here, the written text on this painting, is maybe 12th century or so, Southern Shang. I can't judge that, but supposing that's right, it doesn't mean necessarily that the painting is from that date, because the text could have been written in afterwards in the spaces around the figures. That's quite possible. Notice, for instance, here that the landscape, hills and trees, at the right is broken and then continues a little bit further on, as if the section of text has been set in as separate silk, which is quite possible. And then the other sections of the text are written in the spaces around the figures and the landscape elements. So it's quite possible that the writing was done later. Another feature of this version, the Liaoning version, that makes it less immediately attractive is the bad preservation of the landscape elements, which were painted in mineral green like the ones in the Beijing scroll, but in the Liaoning scroll they have suffered very bad chemical deterioration of the kinds that the Japanese call rokusho yaki. Rokusho is green pigment, yaki is burning, green pigment burning. I should correct my mispronunciation. It's yake, not yaki. I've just posted on my website a note on this under Reminiscences, number 74, titled Rokusho Yake, Green Pigment Burns Silk. Read that if you're especially interested. There's lots of references to publications and so on. This is. I'll show other examples of it as we go along in paintings from later periods too. It's something. It's an affliction that a number of important Chinese paintings have suffered from. I had an argument that went on for years with a learned Chinese friend, I won't name him because I think he was wrong, who maintained that it was the yellow pigment that caused this. But no, it's definitely the green pigment. I've talked with mounters in Japan. I've talked with a chemist at the Freer Gallery. I had some correspondence with them. I meant to publish on this, never did. At any rate, it's a green mineral pigment. It's malachite, a copper compound that's made into a green pigment. The blue is azurite, another copper compound made into a blue pigment. And it's somehow some reaction of the copper pigment with the silk causes the silk to deteriorate. Anyway, you see here the landscape is still made up very much of separate objects, trees, and so on. There's no unified space. But let's go on and look at more of the landscape things. Here's a detail of the Liaoning scroll from a slide. Some bad light reflection, but all right. Showing one of the figures floating up in the air. And here again, you see the application of this heavy mineral pigment, copper compound. Apparently this is what, for some reason, lighter washes aren't affected so much, but when it's very heavily applied, then it sometimes leads to this kind of less kind of deterioration. Still another. Oh, here's a section or a detail of the Beijing scroll for comparison. For some reason, the Beijing scroll hasn't suffered this way. It doesn't always happen by any means, just certain scrolls. And I don't know exactly what the conditions are that make it happen. This chemist at the Freer had some speculation about this. But at any rate, something makes it happen in certain scrolls, but not fortunately in others. And the Beijing scroll is very beautifully preserved and still a very beautiful painting. Okay. Now, here further on in the Liaoning scroll, another section with trees and rocks with heavy blue and green pigment, drawn in outline with heavy color on them, and some of the writing written in, or at any rate appearing in the spaces up above. And then still another section further on, which some of the trees have almost completely disappeared because the silk is so deteriorated. This section has down in it at the right here a figure riding on a phoenix. And I remember this when we discovered the Liaoning scroll and began to compare details. Sometimes you can see a lot more when you get home and you have your detail slides and start putting them up on the screen and talking about them and comparing them. That is, you can see more really than you could see in the original painting, which is partly why I'm doing it in these lectures, because you can reveal a lot more about the paintings than you could seeing them in a case in a museum. Okay, anyway, when we began to look at these closely, I got the idea, began to believe in the priority of the Liaoning scroll, at the priority at least in closeness to the original. And one of my students at that time did a master's thesis on this subject. This was Zhang Tao. She took a master's degree with me and wrote a good master's thesis analyzing the two scrolls and pointing out the ways in which the Liaoning version got things right where the Beijing version gets them wrong. She's the daughter of Zhang Tao, by the way. She's a good young art historian. I haven't been in touch with her recently. So, okay. I remember this phoenix somehow figured in her argument. I don't have the slides to illustrate that place, but I do have slides to illustrate another place, another comparison. Here in an earlier section of the scroll, of the Liaoning scroll, where we see two divine beings floating over the water here, facing each other, confronting, in the way we've seen so often in Six Dynasties art and even in Han art. Now here I have a good detail of those two. Here we are. Next slide. Detail of the two floating figures. Now you see that they do indeed confront each other across a space, one slightly behind the other, and one turning inward to look back, with the other facing forward and seen in profile. And their robes and the ribbons of the robes billow around them very effectively to establish the space around them and to give volume to the image, even though the figures themselves don't seem to have that much of volume. It's more the robes and the ribbons that establish it. This one on the right, for instance, has a broad ribbon that comes from the far side and billows around to the nearest side and around her, and gives volume to the space. The base of the figures, the base of their robes also seem to as if on a flat plane. And all in all, they seem convincingly moving in space and convincingly spacious figures. Okay, then when you see the same figures in the Beijing version, this is not true. I don't have a detail of that, although I think we can make a detail and juxtapose it with the detail from the Liaoning scroll to make that point. But here, as you see them in the floating up above in the Beijing scroll, they are completely flat. Not only is there no convincing space between them, but they themselves don't seem to occupy space in the sense that their ribbons are drawn flat on the plane of the flat plane of the painting. And generally, all together, and they're painted, by the way, in so many different colors that they really don't have the same kind of unity and integrity, you might say, of the figures in the Liaoning scroll. Okay, here's another comparison. The figure of the poet with his attendants from the Liaoning scroll at left, the Beijing scroll at right. And we can see the same difference. Drapery drawing that reads as depicting three-dimensional forms in space, defining volume in the Liaoning version, whereas that in the Beijing version flattens the forms. See, for instance, the sleeves that hang down from his arms, shaded folds that look like truly hanging cloth in Liaoning version versus the repeated flattening lines of the other one. Further on in the Liaoning scroll, you see the nymph of the Law River departing after she's been rejected by the poet, departing from the scene in a huff. Her huff is a chariot and is drawn by dragons. And here you see two river beasts, creatures, large fish with their mouths open, beside the chariot, and all the water, the wind-blown waves, presumably, a very dynamic scene. And the chariot in which the nymph and her attendant sit has some real volume. There's space for her to sit. the two arm rests, whatever they are here at the sides, with rectangular tops, seem to have real volume. And the ribbons that hang from her chariot, as you see, one from the far side, one from the near side, and the ribbons that hang from the near side billow out and then are tied to the armrests, so they billow out, blown by the wind. Very effective. So anyway, this is a scene that you can read spatially in the way the original artist intended. So it must convey more of the original artist's intention in that way. Then, still further on, you see the poet sitting disconsolately on the shore with his two attendants. This is the Liaoning version again, with the writing in the air above him, surrounded by trees and rocks. And well, I'll show another section of this later with the Freer version. A good image of man and nature. And finally, the next slide. The poet goes off in his chariot. This is the Liaoning version again, drawn by 4 horses. And you notice that, like the emperor in the refusing the seat, or the palanquin scene, he is accompanied by a young woman, so he again is not really suffering all that much from his rejection by the nymph, but he's still looking very sad and looking back and wondering if he made a bad mistake, and so on. Okay. This same kind of observations could be made about this as about the nymph's chariot. That is to say, it's volumetric, it's readable, and so on. I don't have a slide of the Beijing version, but it would turn out to be flat in the same way. At one point in the poem, however, the poet embarks in a boat, and the boats in the 3 scrolls are really very interesting and indicative of the standing of the paintings in the way I'm talking about, and I can use them to make my points. This is the boat seen here in this detail from the Liaoning version, and well, it's for the 6 dynasties. It's drawn really quite well, and that it shows the construction of the boat fairly well. These projecting whatever they are from the front and back are indeed a bit awkward, but this is, after all, an early composition, and they hadn't yet mastered perspective and the 3-dimensional drawing of large structures all that well. But it's pretty good. You look inside the windows into the interior of the boat, and down in the lower section here, seen through the lower windows, you see platforms or tables inside, and something may be hanging on the wall beyond. You see what seem to be bamboo blinds up above, pulled up so you can see inside. And at the end of the boat on the left, you look inside again to see something inside the boat, bamboo blind again. The 2 boatmen, this is interesting. The two boatmen are pulling the boat and are pushing with their feet against wooden members that are attached to the outer deck here, almost like a kind of horizontal ladder. And it's very clearly drawn here, the 3-dimensionality of these wooden members, dark side and light upper side. And the boatmen, as I say, push against these with their feet. Now, do I have a detail? Oh, here is the. This is a slide of a photograph, not made by me, but by a friend named Kit Luce. Kit Luce photograph of a boat in the harbor in Hong Kong. And I have it here because you can see over in the left here, barely visible, the same kind of wooden members attached to the outer deck of the boat to be pushed against by the boatmen as they pull the boat. So this way of constructing the boat, or constructing the outer deck for boats that are going to be pulled, continues to be used over the centuries down into modern times. Quite remarkable. Now here's a detail of the upper part of the Liaoning version, which I take, as I say, to be maybe the oldest and certainly the closest to the original. Now, here again you can see, you look into the window at the left, you look into the lower window to see the interior of the boat, but also in the upper part. Here is the poet Cao Zhi and 2 of his attendants, 2 female attendants. And they have a canopy over them, and broad bands, ribbons, bands are laid over the canopy and hang down on both sides. Now on the near side, the canopy hangs straight, or excuse me, on the near side, the band hangs straight down from the near side of the canopy and touches the railing down below. On the far side, it hangs down, but then it's blown by the wind, as the ribbons on the goddess's chariot were in a picture we saw earlier, blown toward us by the wind, and are blown so they almost come over and touch the other side, to the side where the poet is. Well, this is convincing. It's you can read it, you understand what it is, and it belongs within this generally rectangular space that is defined by the railing and by the canopy and so on. So this is all very readable. Now when we go on to the Beijing version, this is by my reproduction, by the way. I don't have a slide made from the original by myself. Well, some of these things are understood right, some are wrong. The two projecting elements, front and back, were a little harder to read, a little more artificial, say, or a little more awkwardly done. The boatmen, what the boatmen are pushing against are not quite so clear. They're still reasonably clear, but they're not quite all there, and they're not shown so well with dark and light sides and so on. And the boatmen seem to be more dancing, really, than pushing, than working. Again, you look into the windows, except that the window at the end, on the left here, is not open, but is occupied by a landscape. A little landscape in ink monochrome was painted there. Now, it's a practice of copyists, in the Sung dynasty especially, I think, maybe 12th, 13th century, whatever, to insert little landscapes in their own style, that is their style of their own period, into paintings that are supposed to be earlier in date. Maybe they put these in to give clues to real connoisseurs as to the fact that it's a copy at all and to the date of the copy, maybe. But we see it often enough to take this as a real practice. Now look at the canopy and the platform up on the top, and the canopy and the row and the bands hanging down from it. The bands on the near side hang down straight down as they should, but the bands on the far side, hanging down from the far side of the canopy, somehow hang straight down now and end up on the near side. In other words, it's quite illogical and unreadable. The same one at the back here, hanging from the far side of the canopy and ending up on the near side of the platform. The artist obviously didn't understand what it was he was supposed to be painting and got it wrong. This is the kind of thing that I say distinguishes the copy, the not so accurate copy, from the early original, or earlier version anyway. Now this is next slide. This is the same boat as seen in the version in the Freer Gallery. I haven't shown the Freer Gallery version before, but before we knew the other two, before they had been published, before we were able to go to China and see them, this was thought of, as I said, as a really important early painting. And I reproduced a section of it in my Skira book and so on. Well, but this is probably based on the Beijing painting, and it's still later. Maybe still Sung, but still later. The little landscape here in the window, and I'll show a detail of it in a minute, ink monochrome again, probably something like 13th century. And the boatmen, the wooden members of the boatmen push against, are completely misunderstood, not understood at all. The artist doesn't know what this is about, so he doesn't bother to paint them convincingly. They don't have any volume anymore. They're just pairs of parallel lines, and so forth. Point by point, everything in this is somehow misunderstood. The bands over the canopy hang down the wrong way again. Here is a detail from the Freer, next please, Freer painting. And here in the left you see the little landscape, ink monochrome landscape, seen through the window, which belongs, as I say, to the 13th century instead of back in the time of GuKaizhi, and it must give away the real date of the copy. We'll see this in several paintings of supposedly early date, but really Sung copies after early paintings as we go along. Here it's a river landscape with a sloping bank of the river and a house building built out from the bank, and then the river itself going back, and here the far shore. And here you can see the the poet and his companions. It's still a beautiful painting, but it's not as close to the original. And here's the end of the scroll in the freer version. The freer version, as I say, is not complete. It lacks the ending, it lacks the beginning. But before we knew anything more, we paid a lot of attention to it. And it was reproduced by Suren and others as an important monument of early painting. I reproduced this, next please, this section of these poet, partly to just put it on as an example of early landscape, in which the figures are bigger than the trees, and things are not proportional, and everything is outlined and colored, and things are arranged to make pockets of space. You know, you can understand how I was able to use this in my Skira book to make certain simple points about early Chinese painting in the early stage of Chinese landscape. The trees in the foreground have to be very small so they don't block the view, so to speak. Well, it was lovely. I didn't make a mistake in putting it in, but I would probably use now. Well, it would be hard to decide because the Liaoning version, as I say, is so badly deteriorated. So much for the nymph of the Law River. I hope it's been an enjoyable and enlightening excursion for you, as it has been for me. It's a painting I'm very much attached to, and its various versions and worked on in all kinds of ways over the decades. Now we go on to show slides which are not from paintings at all, but slides of real scenery. I'm going to go on and finish this lecture by talking about early landscape texts, and especially one by a writer named Zhongbing. I don't have the tones right. My Chinese is no good. Conversational Chinese is hopeless. So don't copy my tones. Zhongbing, anyway. And I'll show, as I'm talking about it, slides that are not from paintings, but from actual scenery at the top of Mount Lu. Painting slides taken from the summit of Mount Lu, the rocky mountain from which you can look down into the Yangzi Valley, the Yangzi River, and the valley in Jiangxi province. Some of us who were at a symposium some years back, on a symposium on the 17th century master Bada Shanran, held in Nanjing, the city further south. Some of us were taken afterwards on a tour that included Mount Lu for several days, quite a wonderful trip. We saw the famous waterfall on Mount Lu and so on. Anyway, this place up on the top from which I took these slides is where the group of Buddhists that I'm going to talk about next, including Zhongbing, the group that Susan Bush writes about in an article I'll speak about, where they met to discuss and meditate and so on. Okay, up to this time, painting had been regarded, as we know from various scraps and commentaries on it in the Han and early Sixth Dynasties text, had been regarded simply as a means of representation or as a moralizing force, the Confucian idea of painting. We have a 3rd century BC text, in which the writer says that dogs and horses are difficult to paint, demons and goblins are easy to paint. Why? Because people know how dogs and horses look, while images of demons and goblins cannot be criticized as failures of visual truth. That is, you can say the artist got the dogs and horses wrong because we know what they should look like, but we don't know that about demons and goblins. Okay, this means simple representation, in other words. Other texts of the early period relate to subjects and how certain images were intended to inspire virtue. Somebody looking at a painting of a virtuous minister, whatever, would be inspired to emulate this person and behave virtuously. But from the Sixth Dynasties period, and especially from the first half of the 5th century, we have the beginnings of a serious theoretical and critical literature about painting, which, starting now, it becomes extremely important all the way down through the rest of Chinese history. The Chinese literature of painting for the early periods outdoes the European history by huge amounts. I mean, if you think of Vasari way up in the Renaissance, and what little, and that is practically the beginnings of art history in the West, and here we are back in the 5th century in China. Anyway, I don't need to make this point. We'll see it as I go through these lectures and talk about the theoretical texts that accompany the paintings. Here we have the beginnings, anyway, of a serious theoretical, critical literature about paintings. We've already talked about She He's 6 laws earlier in this lecture. We have a few fragmentary writings by GuKaizhi. There's a short text on landscape by a writer named Wang Wei, not the same Wang Wei who was the famous poet painter of the Tang Dynasty, whom we'll talk a lot about when we get into Tang, somebody of a similar name, minor character. And most importantly, we have a short essay by an artist named Zhang titled Introduction to Painting Landscape. So Zhang was a devout Buddhist, and he was part of a lay community of Buddhists founded by a monk named Huiyuan, which met on Mount Lu for discussion and meditation and so on. There's a very good essay on him by Susan Bush titled Zhang Essay on Painting Landscape and the Landscape Buddhism on Mount Lu, in a volume that she edited called Theories of the Arts in China. I'll put a reference to this among my readings on my website or whatever else will accompany these lectures. Okay. About Zhang, the artist, we read in an early text that as he grew old and he was no longer able to roam around in the mountains as he had when he was younger, he painted the landscapes that he recollected from his youth on the walls of his room. And then he would lay back on his bed contemplating these landscapes and re-experiencing his early travels. Very important idea, the painting substituting for the real scene or the real thing. Zhang essay begins by saying that mountains and rivers have a material existence, but also a non-material or spiritual quality called chu. Chu is flavor, tendency, interest. It's that to which one responds in something. The thing you respond to, the quality we respond to. And this is why he writes, sages of old roamed in the mountains to respond to the things around them. He goes on to allude to his age and his inability to travel, as the thing written about him that I quoted. And then he writes, therefore I paint images and spread colors, constructing cloudy peaks. And then comes a very important passage that I would render in this way, quote, now, if one takes response to his eye and accord with his mind as his principle, and achieves skill in representation, then all eyes will respond to and all minds be in accord with his paintings. This is very important. The idea is that the artist manages to embody in his paintings his responses to what he sees in nature, and the viewer then responds to the painting as he would to the scene in nature. Well, is this a romantic response, like Byron's to the Alps or Wordsworth's to the Lake Country? Yes and no. These have some things in common. And this 6 Dynasties development is sometimes spoken of as a romantic cult of nature. But it's not like the Western romanticism in which the human spirit is seen as expanding to permeate nature or the world around you, making nature a kind of sounding board for the human spirit. There's no such central position given to man in nature in China. Rather, it's a matter of correspondence between phenomena of nature and the inner phenomena of human spirit. And this is part of this whole Taoist concept of the organic world that I've talked about earlier, with the parts harmonizing in some mysterious non-causal way. Instead of, in other words, the cause and effect universe in which everything works because something else operates on it and makes it work, you have a universe that is a part of a great organism in which everything works in harmony, like the characters in a dance, in an analogy that I think I quoted or will quote. At any rate, something of the magical remains in this way of thinking about the world, investing natural forms and scenes with shun, spirit, or soul, and the human spirit feels an affinity with this and responds to it. And the painter captures this shun in painting, and the viewer then responds as if she or she would to the forms and scenes in nature. Well, I could go on at length again, but what I want to stress is the basic idea that arises at this time and pervades theoretical writings of the time, and that is that the painting evokes the responses that the natural object or the scene would evoke. In my 1958 dissertation, half of it was devoted to the first English language attempt to deal with literati painting theory, the theory of scholar amateur painting, literati painting. We'll come to that late in these lectures, number 9, I think it will be. In that dissertation, I call this the primary concept of artistic expression in China. And it was this one I've just spoken about, which arises in the 6 dynasties. What the secondary concept is, we'll learn when we come to literati painting in lecture 9, I think it will be. Okay, this is the end of this long lecture, which has introduced several important paintings and a lot of what I take to be important ideas, which is why I've talked for so long. Next time we move on to the Tang Dynasty, another of the great long-lived unified dynasties of China. And there won't be as much talk, but there will be great pictures. So I'll see you all then.